let's talk about utilitarianism. Since the middle of the 18th century, utilitarianism has emerged as a powerful but controversial theory of value. It was the dominant ethical and political view in the American philosophy departments until the 1960s, and it continues to exercise some influence right up until today. Utilitarianism is a very special kind of consequentialism. Consequentialism is, as you know from your readings, the view that when we want to evaluate actions, we have to look at their consequences. But this immediately brings up the question, what kinds of consequences matter? Another way of putting this question is, what is the yardstick that we should use to measure the goodness of different kinds of consequences? Different ethical theories and their political offshoots have different answers to this question. Aristotle might say that the actions that are most valuable are the ones that are conducive to a good life, objectively derived from the nature and purposes of human activity. This would be called eudaimonistic consequences, taken from the Greek word for happiness. Another option is to look at voice-tracking consequentialism. Voice-tracking consequentialism might prefer that we measure consequences in terms of how well those consequences satisfy what people say they want. The more people get what they say they want, and the more of what they say they want that they get, the better. So instead of tracking what people say they want, we might actually simply track what they want. That's called will-tracking consequentialism. Will-tracking consequentialism prefers that we measure consequences in terms of how well they satisfy what people actually want, rather than what they say they want. After all, sometimes people might be wrong and mistaken about what they actually want. Figuring out what you want sometimes is hard. The more people get what they want, and the more of what they want that they get, the better, according to will-tracking consequentialism. Another option might be rights-tracking consequentialism, marrying a certain kind of consequentialism with a more deontological concern for individual rights and duties. Rights-tracking consequentialism might say that we should measure good consequences by seeing how many rights people have, which can be measured in terms of how many options they have, or how many legal protections they have from domination by other people. None of these, however, is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, and the utilitarianism in particular of Jeremy Bentham, takes a different approach. Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism is sometimes called classical utilitarianism, to differentiate it from other kinds of utilitarianism that came after Jeremy Bentham. Classical utilitarianism has 5 defining features, summarized roughly as the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Some of you may have heard this phrase before. These features can be summed up in 5 distinct characteristics. First, let me talk about hedonism. Hedonism means that the yardstick is net subjective pleasure. Net pleasure is pleasure minus pain. And it's subjective pleasure because individuals are the only ones who have the authority to decide what counts as good and bad for them. So it's hedonistic. It's also maximizing. It's maximizing, which means that what matters is overall pleasure in the world, and that pleasure should be maximized, or that net pleasure should be maximized. The more net pleasure, the better. Utilitarianism is also agent neutral. Agent neutrality means that everyone's pleasure and pain counts the same. You are not permitted to prefer your mother's pleasure to some stranger's pleasure. Utilitarianism is also aggregative. Aggregative here means that it's the total net pleasure of all individuals that matter, not, say, the average pleasure or the median pleasure. No, we're adding up units of happiness, if you will. And that's what tells us whether things, states of being, or consequences are better off. Does it contribute more to the aggregate happiness of the world? Finally, in its purest form, classical utilitarianism is evaluative rather than action guiding. What that means is that all these criteria that I just mentioned are intended to evaluate the goodness of consequences. It's the yardstick that you use. But it doesn't tell you what rules you should follow when you act. In other words, it would be wrong to assume that because utilitarianism has these 5 defining features, that the best action to take, or rather the intent with which you should act, is to maximize subjective pleasure. What's going through your mind, what rules you follow to make a decision, and what character dispositions get us to maximum net pleasure remains an open question. So utilitarianism is evaluative after the fact. In its classical form, it doesn't yet tell you what to do before the fact, before you act. It doesn't tell you how to act, it tells you how to evaluate actions that have taken place. There are, however, 2 types of action-guiding utilitarianism that have been advanced to answer this question about what rules we should follow. Act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the direct form. It basically tells you to act in the way that you will think will maximize net pleasure. Right? So it tells you, as a rule of action, do whatever looks like is going to maximize pleasure for the most people. Rule utilitarianism is somewhat different. It asks, what rules, if followed, will maximize net pleasure? So on that view, you don't always have to be thinking about net pleasure when you act. You can think about rights and duties as long as you understand that the reasons we have a certain scheme of rights and duties rather than some other scheme of rights and duties is that because the scheme that we have is the one that actually maximizes net pleasure when we follow its rules. Now, as applied to government, utilitarianism says that it's the government's job to maximize the net aggregate subjective pleasure of the population, or perhaps simply to create the conditions under which the population can maximize its own aggregate subjective pleasure. What kinds of policies a utilitarian government would adopt isn't quite clear, and people have extensive debates about that. But by and large, we do know that it means that rights, duties, virtues, democracy, justice, freedom, equality, and so on are at best of secondary importance. They're good if they happen to make people happy, but otherwise have no independent value of their own. Now, utilitarianism has its opponents and its critics. You might already be having your doubts a little bit as you're listening to this lecture, or as you read Jeremy Bentham from your reader. One thing that Bentham doesn't say anything about is who counts as an agent. Does animal pleasure and pain count? Can the government inconvenience you slightly in order to prevent the agonizing torture of thousands of animals? Another question that needs to be answered is, how do you measure utility and pleasure? It's not obvious that all positive or negative feelings are the same. Let me give you an example. Boredom, pain, depression, fatigue, hunger, homesickness, yearning. All of these different emotions, different subjective feelings, are different sorts of things. What utilitarians have to show is that there's some sort of exchange rate that clearly says that 1 unit of boredom is worth half a unit of pain, or something like that. There has to be a conversion rate between all these states of minds for utilitarianism to be able to add them up. Remember, aggregate, it's aggregative. Be able to add them up and then tell us which is better or which is worse. Is an hour of boredom worse than 5 minutes of excruciating pain? Again, utilitarianism has to be able to answer that question in order to get off the ground. Other opponents worry a little bit about whether future agents in their pleasure matters, or only living individuals should count. Is it okay to sacrifice the next generation's pleasure for the sake of the pleasure of current generations? In fairness, utilitarianism is not the only theory that has trouble with that particular question. And we'll talk about that at the end of the semester. So those are some worries. Those are some things that utilitarianism has to solve. Some people have also worried about subjective pleasure, using that as the yardstick. Even utilitarians have worried about this one. One follower of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, who we'll have a chance to read a little bit later in the semester, thought that this question about qualitative versus quantitative pleasures was a bit of a problem. He says, some pleasures you only acquire a taste for once you understand them, and so those pleasures are going to be superior to other pleasures, even though some people who don't understand these higher pleasures don't see the point in them or the value of them. The subjective pleasure of well-informed individuals is then better than just the subjective pleasure of any individual. This provides a way of saying, for instance, that education is valuable, even if you don't enjoy it very much. It's valuable because once you become more educated, you will appreciate things better. You will appreciate different things that you would never choose to go back to the pleasures that you had when you were uneducated. Other people worry about how demanding utilitarianism is on our cognitive capacities. I call this epistemic stringency. Right? How demanding is utilitarianism on our capacity to make calculations? How do we know, after all, what's going to produce the most pleasure? How can we know whether something else might not have been better? It seems that utilitarianism requires to make all kinds of calculations without giving us any way or practical way to do so. It just seems like it requires a whole lot of information that the average person does not have in their brain. Others have thought that utilitarianism was excessively morally stringent or morally demanding. One problem with utilitarianism, or potential problem, is that there is only maximization. There's no room for supererogation, which is a fancy way of saying actions that are above and beyond the call of duty. Utilitarians say that if you can maximize, you should. But there's no real difference or way to come up with a difference between the minimum and maximum moral requirements. And some people feel that any moral theory worth its salt has to be able to indicate what the minimum requirements of living together in society are, and then also say how that's different from what the highest pinnacles of human achievement might be. Utilitarianism just says maximize, and anything short of that is a kind of failing. And finally, the criticism that bugs most people, particularly politically, and probably is most responsible for philosophers moving away from utilitarianism in the 1960s, is that utilitarianism really permits the sacrificing of some people for others, if that would increase aggregate happiness in society. In other words, rights are mostly a contingent affair, and like we said earlier, rights and duties are a derivative matter. They don't have any importance of their own, and therefore utilitarianism seems to logically tolerate torture and execution when such things would produce maximum, or would maximize aggregate net subjective pleasure for society. So, in parting, let me say the following. Although almost no one is a classical utilitarian anymore today, in part because of some of the problems that I just mentioned, those sympathetic to the utilitarian framework, the utilitarian way of thinking about morality, have tried to modify the theory a little bit to make it more plausible. Can you think of what some of these modifications might look like? I'll see you in the discussion forums and find out.